I suffered in silence for years with my family. You won't believe how I managed to free myself. I'll never forget the day my father showed up at my apartment door after years of not looking for me. It was such a shock that even today I get butterflies in my stomach just remembering it. I was already living a new life, trying to pick up the pieces left after everything I'd been through with him and his family, when suddenly I found myself staring into that face that had for so long been synonymous with fear, pressure, and guilt. He was haggard, older, and tired, but his eyes were the same, full of demands, as if I were still that available daughter, always ready to solve his problems. In that moment, 1,000 things ran through my mind. I remembered all the times I'd worked tirelessly just to give him money, the veiled humiliations, the emotional blackmail. I also remembered Patricia, the stepmother who never missed a chance to belittle me, and how she simply disappeared when she realized he had nothing left to offer. It was as if everything came rushing back, like a wave that swallowed me whole. I stood frozen for a few seconds, unsure of what to say. He began to speak, apologizing, saying he was alone, that everyone had abandoned him, and that I was the only person who could help him. His only real family, he said. That's when I felt the old trap springing into place. I knew exactly where this was going, because I'd lived this scene so many times before, only the motive changed. First it was money, then it was emotional support, then it was to clean up the mess he made with others. And it was always me. I always sacrificed myself, always destroyed myself to keep a man standing who never cared if I was on my knees. My heart raced, my hand trembled, and inside, I felt like the voiceless girl again, the daughter who could deny nothing. But this time, something inside me wouldn't let it be the same. I'd already learned the hard way that I couldn't live for others. I'd cried entire nights, carried guilt that wasn't mine, felt an absurd loneliness even surrounded by people, all because I thought being a daughter meant enduring everything in silence. I remembered my Aunt Ines, who always told me I shouldn't feel obligated to support anyone. I remembered my grandparents, Aparecida and Amaro, who always truly welcomed me, who never asked me for anything other than my presence. And I also remembered how liberating it was to cut ties, set boundaries, say no for the first time. I couldn't throw all that away because of a request for reconciliation that, deep down, wasn't about love, but about self-interest. At that moment, I felt so exhausted it felt like my body weighed tons. It was as if my entire history was being tested all over again. He talked and talked, trying to move me, but I could hear it behind his words. He didn't want a daughter, he wanted a support. And I was no longer capable of being that broken pillar. I had spent years rebuilding every inch of myself, fighting the guilt that had consumed me since adolescence, and I wasn't going to let it all fall apart again. But along with this exhaustion came anger. Anger at knowing he was coming back to me only because he had no one else. Anger at realizing that even then, he hadn't been able to truly own up to his mistakes, merely looking for someone to cushion the fall. It was then that I took a deep breath and decided to do what seemed impossible. I said no. Not with pretty words, not with a rehearsed speech, but raw and simple. I told him I wasn't going to help, that I had nothing more to offer, that he needed to learn to deal with his own life. My heart ached. It felt like it was going to rip out of my chest, but at the same time, I felt immense relief. It was as if I had finally removed a chain from my neck. It was hard. I trembled all over. I almost cried in front of him, but I didn't back down. That was the beginning of my true liberation, the day I finally understood that loving myself was the only way to survive. After I closed the door, my legs barely held me up. I slid to the floor and lay there, leaning against it, gasping for air. It was a mixture of pain and victory, as if I'd been through a war in a matter of minutes. My heart was still racing, my hands were cold, but at the same time, a new feeling came. I didn't give in. For the first time, I managed to face the biggest ghost of my life and didn't collapse. I thought about how many times I'd dreamed of this moment, but never thought I'd have the courage. And now it had happened. But along with this strength came an enormous sadness, because no matter how right I was, he was still my father. He was still the person who, in some way, represented my origins, even if marked by pain. I cried a lot on that floor, but it was a different kind of cry. Not of guilt, but of liberation. That day, I realized the word no carried a weight I'd never appreciated. It was as if I'd laid a cornerstone in my new life. I'd always been taught that family was everything, that a daughter should be grateful, that blood spoke louder. But do you know what I discovered? That no bloodline justifies being slowly destroyed. A true family is one who supports you, who stands by you without asking for anything in return, who doesn't make you feel inferior to feel bigger. And when that thought fully entered my head, I realized how much I'd sacrificed for a title that never truly meant caring for me. I won't lie, at first I felt cruel. Guilt hammered at my mind, almost convincing me I'd done the wrong thing. I spent hours remembering the phrases he always used. You're the only one who can help me. A true daughter doesn't abandon her own. You're my responsibility. It was as if those voices still lived inside me, trying to manipulate me again. The difference was that now I was conscious. I could identify where that guilt came from. It wasn't mine. It had never been mine. It was his, thrust upon me like a burden that didn't belong to me. Understanding this was painful, but also liberating. I also thought a lot about my Aunt Inez that day. How many times had she told me that I didn't need to carry the world on my shoulders, that I had the right to be happy without having to pay the price for my father's choices? At the time, I even doubted her, thinking she was exaggerating. But deep down, she was the only one who truly saw how much I was being consumed. And remembering her words in that moment was like an invisible hug. It gave me the strength not to give in, not to open the door again and say I regretted it. Sometimes, the simplest support is what saves us. That night, I lay in bed, unable to sleep. The silence in the room seemed to scream at me, forcing me to relive the scene over and over again. I knew that choice wasn't just about that moment, but about my entire life from then on. I had broken a cycle. I had said enough to the man who had always believed I would be available. And despite the pain, guilt, and loneliness that followed, I also felt a strange peace, as if I had finally made my place in the world. For the first time in a long time, I was in control of my own story. The next day, I woke up with puffy eyes and an emotional hangover. It was as if I'd spent the night fighting with myself. Part of me still wanted to believe I could have been a better good daughter, but another part was firm, telling me I'd done the right thing. I'd spent years believing the right thing to do was to deny myself to please, but in that moment, I understood that protecting myself could also be right. When I got up, I looked in the mirror and saw a version of myself that looked different, even with a tired face. I was someone who had finally set boundaries, and that for me was a victory. Later, over coffee, I thought about what it would have been like if I had opened the door and accepted it all again. I could already see it coming. Within a few days, I'd be supporting him again, resolving arguments, listening to complaints, feeling guilty for not being able to handle it all. It was like a repeated script, one I already knew by heart. Only this time, I'd cut the sequence. I'd changed the ending. And even though it was difficult, I knew I had to stick to this decision. Because every time I said yes to him, I was saying no to myself. In this process, I realized how right my maternal grandparents were. When they said that love doesn't cost anything, they were always by my side, welcoming me when I needed it most, without ever asking for anything in return. They were living proof that family can be care, a lap, a presence without demands. And when I compare this to what I experienced with my father, I understand that what he called love was, in fact, possession. He never saw me as a daughter, but as a tool. This hurts to admit, but it's the truth I needed to face to move forward. It was also during this period that my cousin Claudio became closer to me. I'd never been very close to him, but curiously, he was the one who showed up to listen to me without judgment. I remember saying to him, "It feels like I'm being a monster for saying no to my own father." And he replied something I'll never forget. "A monster is someone who makes you believe your life is worth less than his." That struck a chord, because that's exactly what it was. For years, I believed my life had to take a back seat to supporting his. And realizing that more people saw this gave me the strength to believe in myself. Still, the weight of guilt lingered. I kept remembering his face at the door with that look of defeat, and it ate away at me. It's not easy to see your own father in that situation, even knowing he dug his own hole. But it was in that conflict that I realized I, too, had the right to exist without being sucked in. That my responsibility as a daughter wasn't to save a man who never wanted, to save himself. And the more I repeated this to myself, the more I felt I was building a new version of Marina, one who didn't need to live in chains. A few days after that encounter, he still tried to call me. I saw the number on my phone, and my palms sweated, as if each call were a test. Before, I would answer without a second thought, afraid of seeming ungrateful. But now I let it ring. The silence after the missed call was heavy, but it was also a reminder that I had a choice. And I was choosing myself. This small action seemed simple, but for me, it was gigantic. I was, for the first time, breaking the routine of blind obedience. And each time I didn't answer, it was as if I reinforced within myself, you are no longer a hostage to this. Of course, it wasn't easy. I had crying fits, sleepless nights, and even nightmares in which he would appear, yelling at me or accusing me of abandonment. Guilt is like a poison that takes a long time to leave the body, but at the same time, I began to feel something I'd never truly felt before: lightness. I could spend an entire weekend without having to solve his problems. I could spend my salary on myself without fear of being called selfish. I could simply exist. This feeling of freedom scared me at first, because I didn't know how to live without chains. But little by little, I began to understand that this was the normal I deserved. It was during this process that I began to look back more clearly. I now saw how every action he took had been a form of control. The emotional blackmail, the ready-made phrases about family, the cruel comparisons with others, all of it was a cycle to keep me trapped. And when I realized this, I felt a mixture of anger and relief. Anger for having wasted so many years of my life believing this lie. Relief for finally having discovered the game and escaped it. This awareness gave me new strength, as if I had finally regained a piece of my identity. I told my Aunt Inez all this in a long phone call, and she cried along with me. She said she'd always known this day would come, but that it had to be my decision. And she was right. No one could have made this decision for me. If I'd done it sooner, I might not have been able to do it. If I'd put it off, I might never have done it. It was now, and I did it. It was at that moment that I realized my liberation wasn't just against him, but against everything I'd believed about being a daughter, a woman, a family. I was rewriting my own version of those words. That week, I slept poorly almost every night, but when I did manage to fall asleep, I had different dreams. They were no longer nightmares of pressure, but images of me walking alone, in peace, with no one holding me back. It may sound silly, but for me, this was huge. It was as if even my subconscious was realizing I had turned a new leaf. It still hurts to remember his face. It still tears me apart, knowing we may never have a healthy relationship. But I've learned to accept that not all pain needs to be healed together. Some pains just need to be put in the right place so they don't dominate our lives. Today, when I think about that day, my father appeared at the door. I still feel butterflies in my stomach, but it's different. It's not fear, it's the memory of a battle I won. My name is Marina, I'm 32 years old, and that moment marked a turning point in my life. I felt fear, anger, shame, exhaustion, but I also felt a strength I didn't even know I had. For the first time, I realized that I didn't need to sacrifice myself to be a good daughter or a good person, that my life had value in itself, independent of imposed obligations or the expectations of those who never respected me. That's the kind of clarity that changes everything. After that decision, I began to truly reorganize my life. I took time for myself, set clear boundaries with everyone, including those who thought they only wanted the best for me. I began to value my work, my rest, my feelings. Every step I took was a reminder that I had a right to the peace that previously seemed impossible. It's funny how small things, once simple, took on enormous meaning. Choosing what to eat, choosing who to talk to, choosing whether or not to help. Every choice was a reaffirmation of freedom. My real family, my grandparents and my aunt, were essential in this process. Their support didn't come with demands or expectations, just presence and understanding. I learned that true support doesn't hurt, doesn't tire, doesn't require emotional payment. With them, I felt welcomed and recognized. And when my cousin Claudio showed up, even from a distance, I realized that family can also be built on trust and respect, not just blood. These bonds helped me believe again that it's worth living without fear. Of course, there are still bad days. I still feel that pang of guilt when I remember my father. I still feel the weight of what he represented. But today, unlike before, I can set limits and not let myself be consumed. I've learned that loving myself isn't selfish. that taking care of my balance doesn't make me less of a daughter, less of a woman, less of a human being. I've discovered that life isn't about carrying everyone else's problems, but about carrying my own with dignity and courage. And above all, that freedom is priceless. Today, I feel whole, even with all the scars. I know I did the right thing, and that the peace I've achieved is the result of my own strength. I managed to break a cycle of manipulation and pressure, and I managed to put my life back on track. The pain still exists, but it no longer dominates me. And if there's one thing I've learned through this process, it's that true family is a choice, not an obligation. Loving yourself is the most radical form of survival. And I'm alive, free, and finally at peace.